I'm very pleased, dear colleagues, to join the excellent debate launched by our colleague Senator Cardozo on the future of CBC Radio-Canada. Previous contributions have been very enriching, and they have already spoken relevantly to a number of topics. I would like to address the question of the international network of our public broadcaster, and given what is happening in the world today, the position that it should occupy on the global stage. First of all, unlike a number of voices that we hear, I do not think that the funding of this key institution for our country should not be cut. On the contrary, I think that its budget should be reassessed, taking into account its mandates in our country and worldwide. As pointed out by Senator Forêt, Japan spends $68 per year per capita on its public broadcaster. France spends $79 and Germany $149. For Canada, it is only $33 per capita. So we cannot say that we are overspending in this area. You will have understood, colleagues, I do not believe that the elimination of CBC Radio-Canada is something that should be envisaged. Cutting our public broadcaster, as we know it today, would be a major political error. It would be the loss of one of the most essential links to the ongoing knowledge and information concerning the events that happen in our country and on our continent. In addition, this would create an imbalance between the services offered in both of our country's official languages. In this case, as for all large or major Canadian institutions, this would be unbearable, as occurs when the French language is also ignored by these institutions. I am also of the opinion that the mandate of CBC Radio-Canada compels our Crown Corporation to give all cultures an indispensable tool in the era of GAFA and social media. That is what we should expect from a public broadcaster. So has this expectation been met by current programming? In Canada and worldwide, this is a good question. You will not be surprised, colleague, that I am emphasizing the international dimension of the mandate of our public broadcaster. What it says about our world and what it says to the world about what it means to be Canadian. Our national interests are at stake, and I think that we need a Canadian vision of what is happening in the world. And I think that the world has the right to know what our positions are in terms of peace and security, the development of international institutions and their policies. More specifically about the nature of our environmental, social, and cultural policies. But in past years, Radio-Canada has closed down a considerable number of its offices in the world. Moscow and Beijing both closed down in 2022 because of decisions by local authorities, but also Mexico City, Dakar, Nairobi, and Rio de Janeiro, and in addition to the considerable decline in resources in London and Paris. Someone, somewhere, needs to responsibly examine these closures, this virtual abandonment of the international dimension of its mandate. It is clear that the international network of our public broadcaster has become practically inexistent. In fact, it is totally inexistent on the African continent. Worse yet, some continents have no more permanent correspondence. Once again, on the African continent, This means that a continent that has more than 1.3 billion inhabitants is no longer covered by our public broadcaster. So this means that in French, it simply reproduces the dispatches from Agence France Presse and its incomplete and neo-colonial vision of news on the continent. This means that all we see on our screens is Africa embroiled in a war, in famine and poverty. And this is more than an error. This is systematic and intolerable disinformation. Who in this august chamber has heard that Kenya managed to produce 90% of its national electricity from renewable sources in 2024? That the United Nations Development Program is going to be raising $1 million to establish technological hubs across Africa and support 10,000 young startups. Or that in a difficult global economic context, the IMF announced that in sub-Saharan Africa, the growth rate was 3.8% for 2024. The absence of local correspondence prevents us from clearly understanding the reality of the continent, and it is also a barrier to an effective projection of the Canadian vision in Africa. Dear colleagues,
presence in Africa continent will have many advantages. It will undoubtedly be able to promote common values in terms of democratic governance, right and freedom, including gender equality, and to promote our economic and commercial ties, and will contribute to the dissemination of our scientific and cultural productions. Enfin, en présence.
Furthermore, the presence of CBC Radio-Canada in Africa would bring a Canadian dimension to the ideological debates there, which, as you know, dominate all future perspectives of the continent. China has considerably stepped up its media presence on the continent. Its CGTN Africa network is now broadcast in over 30 countries in Africa. And China is also training African journalists on the ground. And in addition to a station in Kenya and offices across Africa, including Nigeria, Egypt, and South Africa. So these are the offices that it has. Russia, too. Its network Sputnik Africa and Russia Today are a resounding success, especially in the Francophone world.
To speak to the world and broadcast the values dear to our country, the values which define us and which we wish to share with our African partners and throughout the world. Today, let's be clear, in media terms, we have abandoned this formidable responsibility. Radio-Canada doit se projeter.
Radio-Canada must reestablish a presence in Africa, both to restore a true image of the continent or the country, and to disseminate and promote the values of Canada and its vision of the world to an African audience. The future of Radio-Canada also depends on an increased presence on online platforms. That is where the young generations get their information today, and that's where debates are held as well. And this is also true in Africa. According to the United Nations, the youth population in Africa should reach some 830 million people by 2050. And their participation is essential in forging a sustainable and inclusive future. The median age of the continent is only 19.7 years old, which makes it the youngest in the world. I would add that according to the International Telecommunications Union, the usage rate of the internet in Africa has more than doubled over the past 10 years and now stands at some 40% of the African population. And I think that is probably another piece of good news that you probably have not heard in our media. Dear colleagues, in closing, I would like to reaffirm how important it is that our country have a public broadcaster that fully fulfills its mandates, including our relationship with the world. This deserves very close attention. Thank you very much for your attention.